jump right in. Beginning to look at Unit 4 Area of Study 1, we'll start with the composition of Parliament. So, this is crucial for you to understand because this is what you study for the rest of the year. So, this knowledge you have to have. Um, Obviously, we have the lower house, which is very, very important. House of Representatives in the Commonwealth Parliament, and in the State Parliament in Victoria, it is called the Legislative Assembly. This is the house that forms government, either Commonwealth level or state level government. So the party with the majority of seats in the lower house after an election, they come together and they form what's called executive or representative government, or really both. Um, and that's your major party with the majority of seats. They can pass through laws quickly because they have the majority of seats in the House, so they can just approve them. Um, and therefore, this house is very, very important. Then we have our upper house, which is our house of review, often referred to that way because this is where laws are not usually introduced, but a bill, a proposed law, is usually raised in the lower house. It goes through the three reading steps there, gets approved, and it goes to the Senate, where it also needs to go through these steps and also be approved. In turn, they often actually review the legislation and scrutinize and debate the legislation rather than introducing it themselves, even though they have the power to do so. So, this is the Senate in the Commonwealth Parliament, and in the State Parliament, this is the Legislative Council. We won't go into detail about the composition of each house, just be aware that that's something you need to be aware of. And it's different at state level and parliament level as well. So don't get them mixed up, and also watch out for the names, don't get them mixed up. So, lastly, at the very top of the pyramid, technically has the most power, the Queen's representative, the Crown. We know, however, that the Crown, the monarch in England, doesn't really do this. They don't partake in lawmaking, and and do anything really. So they're actually represented by the Governor General, which is the Crown's representative in the Commonwealth Parliament. And in the State Parliament, this is the Governor. So make sure you remember this and don't confuse this and lose marks when you're responding to questions. All right, so understanding the levels of parliament might not be the easiest thing, but it's the understanding that you have to have first, and then you'll quite easily be able to memorize everything. Hopefully, you guys are finding Unit 4 all right. I know it is very different from Unit 3. So we'll look at the roles of the lower houses first. These are, as we said, the House of Representatives at the Commonwealth level, and at Victorian level, it is the Legislative Assembly. So what are the roles of the lower house? As we established, they form government. The party with the majority of seats following the election will form government. The leader at Commonwealth level will become the prime minister, and they will decide for other members of their party to become ministers. Essentially, with some administrative powers, which we'll look at the powers, separation of powers soon. And they're going to be able to do various things. You've heard of things like education minister, health minister, treasurer. So the titles kind of denote the roles that the ministers can sort of have. And there will be other parties, of course, in the lower house. They will not have as much power on their own. If we do have a clear majority in the lower house, they won't be able to really stop laws from passing through there because the government party itself will have more than 50% of members being able to vote bills through. They won't be able to stop laws, and if they do initiate laws without the support of the government party and their approval and their vote yes, um, it's not going to be able to pass through. So the lower house also initiates, debates, and votes on bills. This is a role that the Senate has also, the upper house also possesses. You can see that there's a lot of overlap between the roles. We talked about the bill initiation already, but someone will step forward, such as a minister will step forward and propose a bill, and debating and voting happens in both houses on every bill because it needs to pass through both houses. They also control government spending. So they can initiate and pass money bills, um, and yeah, essentially decide how money should be spent on the country. The Senate or the upper house cannot do this. So this is a difference in their roles. They don't work, they don't handle money bills. It can also act as a house of review, but we talked about how this is mainly a role of the upper house rather than the lower house, reviewing and scrutinizing laws simply because of oftentimes how usually their composition is. And that being that usually the Senate has a different composition to the House of Representatives, with different parties having more members there, and then they can actually halt laws, ask for amendments in return for their support for the bill, um, or reject them if they deem them to be inappropriate. So the lower house can scrutinize government, so can the Senate, and they can examine bills and issues in parliamentary committees. You'll learn about this later on, but we can investigate laws before we pass them, and public approval for those laws, whether the public really wants them or not, and how effective they're likely to be, by the government initiating an investigation, and really a couple types of investigations into them. Um, During this process, it's a thorough investigation, and a report is generated and tabled in Parliament and presented to Parliament. Based on that report, they can decide what the best course of action is. However, they have no obligation to commit to anything. So, just how they form government, this also includes representative government because directly chosen by the people. Remembering that from the Constitution, we'll have more of a look on that. So, the upper houses, as we discussed, it is the Senate at the Commonwealth level, and at Victoria level, it is the Legislative Council. So, what does the upper house actually do? Well, there's a lot of overlap. We see some of the same things, acting as a house of review, reviewing laws. We know this is more the upper house's role than the lower house's. Scrutinizing government also more commonly happens in the upper house than the lower house. They can also examine bills and issues in committees, though this is more likely to often happen in the lower house. Um, and remembering the clear differences. So they cannot initiate money bills. They will still vote on them. So if the lower house initiates a bill related to money or government spending, it will pass through. The senators will still be voting on that bill. It's just that they can't initiate it. And they also, rather than how the lower house directly represents the people, because they're directly chosen by the people, so therefore forming representative government. Instead, the upper house represents the interests of the states and regions of Victoria. Just remember how it's composed. 12 senators are chosen from each state and two from each territory based on broader sort of geographical regions. So instead, they represent the interests of distinct geographical regions or electorates, as we call them. And this is very different to the House of Representatives, where people just vote for members. And this is supposed to be a good thing that we have the House of Reps representing the people versus the upper house. We have senators representing the interests of the states. But in reality, we know that that's not really true because all of them belong to some kinds of parties. Um, so essentially, that function not fully fulfilled just because they're still party members. So it's not as much interests of the states as much as it is interests of their respective parties. Um, Having a look next at the roles of the crown. Essentially, when we talk about this, we're talking about what does the governor general do? Because the crown is represented by the governor general. So it's not actually the monarch, not the crown, doing all of these things. We have a constitutional monarchy in Australia, which means that we have a constitution and we have a monarch, the crown, very self-explanatory, good term. And the crown is the head of state, and it has its representative at state levels and Commonwealth levels. So The governor doesn't have this excess of power. They have certain roles that they fulfill solely just as part of representing the crown. So that's a common misconception that some students have, that the governor general has this like infinite power. Um, so what does the governor general actually do representing the crown? Through the passage of bills, the last step is when it passes both houses, and during the vote, more than 50% of each members, both in the lower house and the upper house, say yes to the bill. There is a last step called royal assent. In this step, the proposed law, actually goes to the governor general, and they have to give it like it's the royal stamp of approval so it can actually become a law and actually become part of legislation. If this doesn't happen, the law cannot be passed for whatever reasons they choose not to give royal assent. It might be just that some amendments are needed, and they might do the whole process again of trying to pass the law from the beginning, and it might get approved again. But so of course the governor general, because they grant this royal assent, they can either grant royal assent or withhold it. This really doesn't happen very often or much at all. There would be some kind of reason for this. Um, there's something about the law just being probably viewed as really bad or against the interests of the country. So when they grant royal assent, they just sign those bills as the last step, and then they can become part of legislation and law. Um, they also appoint an executive council. This is our government. So this is a formal step. So those members of the lower house that had formed the majority of seats in the lower house after an election, they will be appointed as the executive council by the governor general, meaning simply that they will have executive powers, which we will also look at later. This essentially means that, yeah, the same thing. Party leader becomes prime minister, and they can select ministers for various roles in managing the country. The governor general also appoints federal judges. So these are judges for the high court, of course. So this is their role. So we can see already there is some overlap between judicial powers and the governor general, which technically has both legislative and administrative slash executive powers as well. So this can be a bit of a disadvantage when we talk about it later on. And they can also dissolve parliament. So what does this mean? Obviously, re-elections in the House of Reps are every 3 years. However, what might happen is the Governor General might suspect that there's some corruption or bad things going on in Parliament, and they may choose to dissolve it early and have an early re-election. This wouldn't be, again, a thing that would happen often at all. This is almost like an emergency power held by the Governor General. So we're going to look at the division of powers, which is the very next dot point. We've literally already covered one of the dot points on the study design for Unit 4 Area of Study 1. Of course, in going into depth, you'd want to also be aware of the compositions of each house, how many members, how are they selected, and you also want to be able to draw um, the be able to discuss the strengths and the weaknesses or the limitations of the roles of each lower house, upper house, and the Queen's representative. So that's something to also work on. So next we'll have a look at the division of powers. These are the lawmaking powers that are given to Parliament to create laws. They are divided between the state parliaments and the Commonwealth Parliament. So when we look at separation of powers later on, it is really important that you can tell the difference between the two, because a question will just mention like division of powers or separation of powers, and if you answer based on the incorrect concept, you will not get any marks. So make sure you try to commit the names to memory and have strong links in your brain. So division of powers, how it's divided between the states and the Commonwealth. Separation of powers refers to how there's no overlap between judicial, executive and legislative powers, or supposedly. And it's separated by the Constitution. So we'll have a look at that concept as well later on. So this division of powers decides essentially, obviously we have states and we have the Commonwealth. So how do we know which parliament is going to have which powers? And it resolves this problem. So these are exclusive, concurrent, and residual powers. Having a look more in depthly, exclusive powers, the title is so self-explanatory. They are exclusive to the Commonwealth Parliament. Only the Commonwealth Parliament can legislate in these areas. The states can absolutely never legislate under any circumstances in these areas. Um, so exclusive powers are usually just specifically noted or entrenched in the Constitution that the Commonwealth has those powers. That's something else that you need to know. And examples of these include things that are very, very clearly only the country itself can do, such as defense, military, currency of the country, border protection, and of course, you might even say things like Commonwealth level, like criminal offenses. There's lots you could think of. You might think about export and import with other countries as well. So, of course, the Commonwealth can legislate there and not the states themselves, because the laws for the entire country would be in disarray. There would be no uniformity across the country. And if each state had its own military, we could have things like civil wars, and that would not be very good. So, next we'll have a look at concurrent powers. Again, a very self-explanatory title, which is very, very great. Concurrent is clashing. Both the states and the Commonwealth parliaments have powers in these areas, hence they're concurrent. Um, and this is where, so both the Commonwealth can legislate in these areas and the states can legislate in these areas also. So we'll have a look at section 109 and the significance of it, because it essentially tells us what would happen if both parliaments made laws in the same areas and they contradicted. So very important, because of course that is inevitably going to happen. So what are some examples? Trade, taxation, and marriage and divorce. So still have separate laws in states and Commonwealth parliaments for such things. So makes lots of sense. So trade, for instance, yes, we might have import and export, for example, laws in the states, like even between the different states, and then Commonwealth might consider the other countries, so international trade and export, and legislate in those areas. Taxation, you have some local taxes like council tax, and car car payments, pet payments, but on Commonwealth level, everyone's income will get taxed the same, for example. So let's instantly jump into section 109 and look at its significance and what it does when we have concurrent laws. So this section of the Constitution states that when a law of a state is inconsistent with a law of the Commonwealth, meaning the two are clashing, the latter shall prevail, and the former shall, to the extent of the inconsistency, be invalid. So the Commonwealth law will prevail or continue to operate, and the state law will be abolished or removed, essentially declared invalid, but only to the extent of the inconsistency. So only the aspects that clash with the Commonwealth law will be declared invalid. The rest of the law will continue to operate. So it's really important to understand that state legislation only becomes invalid to the extent of the inconsistency. This is the one thing that you should be able to remember off by heart and quote for section 109. You can state the section in your own words because you will have to describe it, but to the extent of the inconsistency is very, very key. So what does this section 109 do? It obviously gives more power to the Commonwealth and takes more power away from the states in terms of lawmaking. As you'll see later for Unit 4, this is an ongoing theme. Everything takes away power from the states and gives more power to the Commonwealth. We'll look at this when we see more high court decisions and more disputes that have come up. So we can see that there. Section 109 protects the Commonwealth, enhances their lawmaking power by allowing their laws to remain completely in operation, and it inhibits state laws' powers because it reduces them when there is a clash. So you need to be, that's the significance of Section 109, that you need to be able to analyze what it does to state powers, what it does to Commonwealth powers. Also, pretty fair that the state law can still operate only to the extent of the inconsistency is removed. So in reality, it can still operate. It's not so bad um, or so limiting. So lastly, we have residual powers. And these are the lawmaking powers held only by the state parliaments. Um, and this is generally everything that doesn't fall into the Commonwealth Constitution. So there is no sections in the Commonwealth Constitution that mention these residual powers. Therefore, by default, they are state parliament powers. So everything that is not exclusive, everything that is not concurrent, um, so essentially everything that isn't in the Constitution is a power that belongs with the states. Lots of examples here, probably the easiest to think of for your describe and explain questions for these division of powers, such as criminal law, education, and public transport. Just consider in terms of education, every state has a different education system. Similarly with public transport, that is because they have been able to legislate and create their own. It does not have to be by default the same across the entire country. Um, so it turns out to be the majority of lawmaking powers. This is a really good quote. In order to keep in line with the purpose of the Constitution. The initial purpose of the Constitution, when it was established, because Australia was coming together as a federation and all of these states joining together into a federation. So it tried to reinforce this purpose of not taking power away from the states, but allowing them to retain as much power as possible without the Commonwealth powers interfering too much. Therefore, this is the majority of lawmaking powers are residual. So that's another dot point done on the study design. Next, we'll have a look at how the Constitution acts as a check on Parliament and their lawmaking powers, essentially trying to prevent corruption, trying to prevent Parliament from being able to do whatever they want, legislate on whatever they would like, and abuse their powers and even go above and beyond what's in the Constitution and go directly against it. So, Constitution protects us against this by several things that it establishes. This includes the bicameral structure of Commonwealth Parliament. By meaning two, bicameral structure simply means there are two houses, a lower house and an upper house. So at Commonwealth level, our House of Reps and our Senate. Then the separation of powers, the one that is not to be confused with the division of powers, the express protection of rights. These are five rights that are entrenched or written down in the Constitution that are protected for the people of the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth cannot legislate against them. They are ensured for the people and offer some protection. We have the role of the High Court in interpreting the Constitution. We'll look at quite in detail, and the requirement for a double majority referendum, making referendums very difficult, making it difficult to change the Constitution, and therefore protecting the people because the Parliament isn't able to alter any protections that we have in sections of the Constitution without our support. So having a look at the bicameral structure. Like we established, this refers to a structure that consists of two houses of parliament. So both state and Commonwealth parliaments follow the bicameral structure. But what's key to understand, and you can say for these evaluate questions you will have for this mini area study, evaluate questions, right? So that is a bit of a weakness because if it's in the Constitution, it's not in state level legislation. So state parliaments can actually have a one house structure if they want. And we see this in Queensland. This offers less review for laws, obviously, and that can be a disadvantage. So the bicameral structure is only assured at Commonwealth level, and this is a weakness. So under the Australian Constitution, Section 1 that you need to know about It is Section 1 that establishes that there are two houses within the Commonwealth Parliament, um, not one, but two. And then we know in more specific detail, Section 7 and 24 establish the Senate and the House of Representatives and all of their roles. We will also be having a look at those sections. So having a look at the bicameral structure, what are some strengths and some weaknesses? Of course, a strength is that it is entrenched in the Constitution, so this protection cannot be abolished or removed without a successful referendum. It also ensures that each bill that is passed is scrutinized and debated by the two houses, making sure that we have a process for reviewing our laws before they are passed, not just one house that can just pass laws through because it's what they want to do for whatever interest that they have. This also enables us the aspect of reviewing laws to identify errors and omissions in bills and make amendments or changes to issues that have come up with laws. Of course, there are some limitations also. So the three structures that you need to know about for the bicameral structure are the hostile Senate, the rubber stamp, and the rubber stamp acts as a huge limitation as well. Essentially, this is not common at all, but sometimes the composition in the Senate will be similar to the House of Representatives, making it a rubber stamp Senate. It will just stamp on laws, give them a passive approval, and they will pass on and become legislation. In this case, the major majority of seats, the party that's forming government in the lower house, they also have the majority of seats in the Senate. And they have more than 50% of people, so they can just approve those laws and get them passed. Of course, this is a huge, huge disadvantage. What we really want is a hostile Senate. And this is the structure that we usually have. Again, another term that you need to know. Why is the Senate hostile? Because they have a different composition from the House of Representatives, meaning the major government party is not the majority of the senators there. So laws can't get passed unless the government party is trying to get the approval of the senators and all the different parties that are there to get that 50% of votes plus. Um, and then, of course, last structure is a hung parliament. It is hung because it struggles to pass laws and it is very slow to pass laws if it is still passing them. In this case, there is no one single major party in the House of Representatives. There is no one major party forming government and being able to pass laws alone. So those are the three structures to know of. Some more limitations that, as I discussed, the structure is not entrenched. It's not in the constitution for Victorian or other state parliaments. That's why Queensland can have a parliament with one house. The lower house is controlled by government, and therefore laws are generally only passed if they are supported by the government. That is a fatal flaw in the bicameral structure, is that the government has way too much authority and they are able to pretty much do all of the lawmaking until the next election if the composition changes. All right, that's one. That's the bicameral structure done. Next, looking at the separation of powers. Reminder not to be confused with the division of powers. The separation of powers you need to be able to define. It's a principle established by the Commonwealth Constitution that ensures that the three main functions performed by the Australian parliamentary system remain completely separate. So we have executive power, legislative power, and judicial power. In theory, these are supposed to be separate, but they overlap. So executive power is essentially administration of laws and managing the business of government. So how laws from when they come into legislation are actually put into effect. And a lot of the work in relation to this is done by that leading that representative government, that majority of seats in the lower house, because they have executive powers. They have all the ministers, they have a lot of power, and therefore you can already see they're in parliament creating laws and they're also administering the laws. So there's a significant overlap between executive power and legislative power, and that could mean lots of things. It could lead to corruption and abuses of power, etc., etc. So, of course, legislative power is the power to make laws. This is our upper and lower house. And of course, the governor general, who's representing the queen, fits into both executive and legislative power. Legislative, why? Because they give or withhold royal assent to pass a law. Executive power, they literally appoint the executive government, and the judges also, they have lots of power. Judicial power is the power to enforce the law and settle disputes. When we're talking about this, we're more so talking about the high court judges um, being able to do this at Commonwealth level and regarding the interpretation of the Constitution. Now, in theory, this is kept pretty separate. The Governor General technically represents both executive and legislative power and overlaps with judicial power because he appoints the High Court judges. However, in theory, this is not much of an issue. Um, it's not likely to be many problems arising from this because it's more of a formal step. So, in theory, judicial power is kept pretty separate, and you can discuss that as a strength for your evaluate questions. So, again, just a reminder not to confuse the two. Try to make it easy for yourself to remember somehow. I feel like separation and division kind of have different connotations, and it sort of makes sense. So, what are the strengths and limitations of the separation of powers? Again, this is a recurring point that you will see for all of the five checks on Parliament. It's entrenched in the Constitution, so we cannot abolish the separation of powers also without a successful referendum, which is never going to happen because why would we remove our own protections that we have for ourselves and set ourselves up to really fall at a disadvantage where the Commonwealth could remove these checks. It allows for the executives to be scrutinized by the legislative power holders. So, considering that um, people administering laws and managing government will be scrutinized by members of parliament, especially this happens in the Senate, saying that they're doing things wrong, they're not administering laws effectively that have come into power, etc., etc. This obviously sparks a lot of media attention, and they may legislate to change some of these things if they do so successfully. The problem here and the disadvantage that comes from this is that the legislative and executive powers are combined, as we said, by that government, that representative government of the time. So this really decreases the ability of this to act as a check on the separation of powers. And there's not as much scrutinizing going on, except maybe more so in the Senate if it's not a rubber stamp, because in the House of Reps, it's that a representative government that has the majority of the seats, and they can just pass things along. So that can be a bit of a flaw. If there is problems with executive powers and things need to be changed, legislative powers may struggle to enact any real change or not want to do so because of that executive government being in parliament. Also, judiciary powers, we can quite well say, are very relatively independent from both parliament and the government, and executive and legislative powers, meaning that judges will should always interpret the Constitution in a just and correct way and have the people's best interests at heart and not do things that benefit the Parliament and government. Um, Also, some other weaknesses, we already discussed the first one, but we said that judges are appointed by the executive, so are obviously our governor general acting as a representative of the crown, and this can be not a good thing, I guess, if the governor general has some subconscious biases and stuff. Judges are also protected because they cannot be they have a very late retirement age and they cannot be removed from the high court unless there's some evidence of corruption and unlawful behavior, which is very difficult to then prove. So they are protected once they are appointed. Another limitation is, again, you'll see this throughout, the Constitution only provides for the separation of powers at a federal level, not state level. So the next thing that we need to have a look at is the express rights. These are also known as explicit rights. If you see that, it's just a synonym. You need to be able to define them. Don't use the word express in the Constitution because that is the same word as the word in the actual term. So you can say that they're specifically entrenched or listed or enumerated or stated in the Constitution. Entrenched and enumerated are stronger words, however, to use. And there are only 5 protections that we have under the Australian Constitution. So you need to know all of these. You could even have a 10 marker where you have to discuss all of these. More likely so, you would have a 10 marker to evaluate all of the ways in which the Constitution acts as a check on Parliament. So be prepared for that. Have good knowledge for all of these dot points. So, what are the 5 express rights under the Australian Constitution? It is the right to freedom of religion, which is our section 116, which we need to remember. Essentially, the government cannot impose laws interfering with religious practices or declare that one religion is the religion of the country, which offers protection for people to have a variety of religions here and nothing to interfere with their practice. The right to free interstate trade and commerce in section 92. You do need to remember the sections. This is very straightforward. The title is self-explanatory. It means that the states can trade and have import and export with each other for free, and cross borders for free. The right to receive just terms when a property is acquired by the Commonwealth in section 51 and subsection 31. That's what XXI is, subsection 31. This means that the Commonwealth can take your property from you, but they must provide you with just terms. So, think of that what you will. That is extremely broad, meaning the Commonwealth could easily get around it. But think of things like giving sufficient time to vacate, giving some financial compensation, or offering maybe alternative housing, things like that. The right to a trial by jury for indictable Commonwealth offences in Section 80. This is the one that you already know about because you studied the criminal justice system in Unit 3 Area of Study 1. So that should be nothing new. Keep in mind that this is only for Commonwealth level offences, not state level criminal offences, Commonwealth. So we're looking at some more serious stuff like fraud and terrorism, things like that. Not Therefore not used as often, this power. Um, so, the right not to be discriminated against on the basis of the state where you reside is our last one, section 117. Easy to remember because it just follows on from section 116. Essentially, residents of other states cannot be discriminated against, whether that's verbal, whether that is a form of you're trying to move and no one wants to hire you for work, or uh, give a contract for a tenancy for you, or they try to make things more expensive for you. It could mean lots of things, but essentially every resident of every state in Australia can be a resident in another state. They just have to move, do some paperwork. There's no discrimination for them. They can be a resident of any state that they like. They can travel around the country, etc., etc. So lots of things go into that. Again, very broad. That is a limitation of all of these express rights. They are broad. There have not been many disputes where these express rights have been brought to the High Court. Therefore, it is unclear even in which circumstances what the Commonwealth can do, cannot do, what is a breach of an express right, what isn't a breach of an express right. That's a big overarching limitation. Similarly, if a person's rights have been infringed, they have to have lots of money and funds to initiate a high court case. So it's going to be very expensive to take a claim to the High Court and potentially also time consuming. Much more so than if you're thinking like, is it like the Supreme Court? It's much more. So another problem with that is you can just take it to the High Court. they will, if they do agree with you, they can just declare a law invalid, or say that someone has to stop, doing this kind of action against you that was infringing your rights, um, kind of like an almost an injunction type thing. But you cannot get any monetary compensation, any damages in the High Court. There is no compensation. You're pretty much just going there to have a law declared ultra vires or invalid. So this is really problematic and makes a lot of people unmotivated to bring their claims to the High Court where express rights have been infringed, for instance. Similarly, to try to protect express rights and breaches of express rights, an individual has to have standing, meaning that they have to be directly affected by that law's operation. It has to have directly impacted them in a negative way. I can't just be an interest group or someone who believes in pursuing like human rights, and I can't just take a claim to the court, even if I have the costs, and even if I have the best interest in mind. Only people with standing who are directly affected. That's lots of limitation to whether these express rights are actually attempted to be questioned. And rights that are protected, as we said, are limited in scope. It's very broad, lots of ways for the Commonwealth to surpass them. Not enough disputes to define how they actually work, and all the exceptions and things that would apply and still serve as a protection for those rights. Similarly, not really applying at state level. Another limitation that we've been seeing constantly, for example, just indictable Commonwealth offences, not state level offences, Section 80. What are some strengths of the express rights? They're again entrenched in the Constitution, so they cannot be abolished without a referendum. If a person believes that a law is infringing upon these rights, they can take a case to the High Court. So once we've discussed the limitations, the strengths are very easy to understand. And a High Court case can act swiftly in declaring a law ultra vires, meaning beyond the powers of Parliament, meaning invalid. This is a term that you need to add to your vocabulary also.